So if you're taking notes, and I hope you are, it's called the Traumatized Brain. And that's so cool. Don't you have you just thought about that first overview when you had 200 billion connections to God? You have 10,000 Milky Ways in your brain. How cool is it that we have that? And because we have such a really incredible God and our brain is really incredible, even if you face trauma, you can be rewired. You don't have to stay there. I want you to get that. You don't have to stay there. Amen. Isn't that good? Yeah. That's good. So in Isaiah 38, 16, 17, this is NIV version, and I love this. It says, "You restore to me health and let me live." Oh, we can stop right there. Amen. Oh, that's so good. But look at that next sentence. "Surely it was for my benefit that I suffered such anguish." And trauma is anguish, by the way. And I love that. This is, "In your love, you kept me from the pit of destruction. You have put all my sins behind your back." Listen, if you can't get happy about that, we need to do some work. Come see me at J-Rock. But right there, when he says, "It was for my benefit that I suffered such anguish," I thought, wow, God, you have spoke some serious business right there. But it was in your love that you kept me from the pit of destruction, which is where the devil wants us. And that's why he wants your brain to stay traumatized. He wants your brain to stay there. But God doesn't want that. So I'm going to start out with a couple quotes. And before I do that first one, I need you to understand that trauma does something to us. And it's one of those things, and I can understand when people come in and they've had such things happen to them, whether it was by somebody else or their own decisions. And I have had both, by the way. I have an addiction history, so that was my fault. And the other stuff that happened to me, that wasn't my fault. And so coming in, and whether it was our own hand or someone else's hand in the trauma, that it's like we live in a whole different world. And what trauma does to our brain makes us feel like we're in a whole different world. And so when you see somebody, I always see somebody now when I start talking to them or I see how they act, I don't go "Oh God, here we go again." I go, I bet that brain's hurting right now. I wonder what it would look like. This is so free, it's not on my notes. I wonder what it would look like if we started looking at each other like that. When we see somebody maybe acting out, or we see somebody who's snappy, or we see somebody who's isolated, or we see somebody who's not making the best decisions, and we go, I ain't got time for that. I wonder if we said, I wonder what's going on in their brain. I wonder if they've been hurt and they don't know what to do with it. Because a lot of us get hurt and we don't know what to do with it. And that happens to our body, and our brain takes us down a path that's not the best. So this first quote says this. It says, "To live in the body of a survivor is to never be able to leave the scene of the crime. I cannot ignore the fact that I live here." That's deep. If you've ever had anything happen to you, you've ever had something that was traumatizing without getting it out in the right way, it's almost as you live at the scene of the crime. And then why that really spoke to me, you may or may not know this, but I'm a retired police officer, so understanding the scene of a crime, and that's what's left after something bad has happened. And so having to live there in that scene of the crime, it was like, wow, and I can't ignore the fact that I live here. I wonder if we started looking at people like, wow, they're having to live in something that's not easy, and they don't know how to get out. Sometimes, and most times, I think in trauma, people don't know what to do. But in Christendom, we're really quick to judge. I wonder what it would look like, hopefully after this journey that we've had, that you won't be the person that says, well, you made that decision, as opposed to the person that says, hey, let me help you up. Let me help you up, let me dust you off, let's see what we can do to get you better. I got this really cool healer, his name is Jesus. Let me introduce you to him. I wonder what would happen if we started doing that. Still not on my notes. The next slide. It says this, and I love this. He says, trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside you as a result of what happened to you. And what I want you to understand, like if you start looking up trauma on Google or whatever service you use, they're going to quickly go to the medical trauma. And that is, it's a wound. And so when we talk about trauma, when I'm talking about trauma, I'm not talking about the outside. Although there is some good correlation there. We can't get anything fixed on the outside if we keep ripping off the Band-Aid and not putting on our ointment, right? It's the same thing. I want you to understand that trauma happens inside because of what happened on the outside. And that's what's different about a medical trauma as opposed to an internal trauma. Does that make sense? And next song. Here we go. Remember last week I talked about attachment, right? And how good attachment was. It says our brains are wired for connection, but trauma rewires them for protection. And that's why healthy relationships are difficult for wounded people. And listen, I don't know that I ever met a person who was not wounded. Not of age, anyway. I mean, I meet some babies that are not wounded yet. But of age, I've never met a single person who does not have a wound. And wounded people will see through wounded eyes, they will hear through wounded ears, and they will speak through a wounded mouth. And what happens is when they're wounded, when we become wounded, remember those connections, those attachments I talked about? What happens is now, since we have trauma and trauma's invaded our brain, now instead of making a connection, it goes, I can't trust you. I can't trust you. I can't trust you. And I want to protect myself and I'm going to wall myself in. And you know what? It's a really lonely place behind the wall. And you really are not protected. But that is what your brain does. That's good. Isn't that good? That's, when I saw that, I thought, wow. Because we are wired for connection. We're wired for attachment. And if our attachment becomes something that is corrupted, then our brain's going to be like, I need to do what I can to protect it. And you know what happens? Our brain starts believing a lie. So the definition of insanity, what is it? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, right? I'm going to give you a new definition. It's not on the board, so you're going to have to write it down. And it's from Focus on the Family. Some of you know this, but we're going to write it down anyway. It's good for you to have it a second time. So insanity from Focus on the Family, when we did the Truth Project, this is what insanity is. You believe the lie. I'm just going to say it all at once and I'll come back, okay? You believe the lie. That lie becomes your reality. And then you do foolish things to demonstrate it. So you believe the lie. That lie becomes your reality. And then you do foolish things to demonstrate it. Let me give you an example of that. I'm not worthy. Nobody loves me. I can't make it. I'm never going to heal. So then that lie becomes my reality. I start living out that lie. And so the foolish things I'm going to do to make that happen is I might start isolating. I'll stop going to church. I'll stop reading my Bible. And I'll have a whole slew of excuses of why I don't. And then we start living in insanity. I like that definition better, by the way. Because I want you to get this, is that our enemy is very cunning, and he wants you to believe the lie that you can't get better. He wants you to believe the lie that your brain can't get better. He wants you to believe the lie that you can't go on. He wants you to believe the lie that things will never be better or the same. And what I do know is when we suffer loss and when we have things that happen, I know things will never be the same. But I know things can be better with the Lord. Things will be different, but God can bring something good from it. It's the beauty from ashes. But it all comes back to the Lord if we allow it to. So now tonight's going to be like almost kind of a little bit clinical because I gotta lay the foundation of what trauma is. Okay? So let's define trauma. So this is what the APA says. It says that trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. Short-term responses are typically shock and denial, while long-term responses can include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms like headaches or nausea. These are normal responses to abnormal experiences. That's what our secular people say. That is how they define trauma. They say it's something that terrible has happened, and it's our emotional response to it. And they say, it's normal responses to an abnormal experience. I get that. It makes a little bit of sense to me. This is what I like to say that it is. It's a wound. Trauma is a wound or an injury. And it's just so simple for me. I have to be simple. And I need to keep it simple because I'm the girl that is simple. But if I look at trauma and I know that it's a wound or injury, and remember the difference for medical trauma and the trauma I'm talking about is the wound is on the inside. The wound is on the inside. And it takes a little longer for the inside to heal than it does the outside. I've talked with many a domestic violence survivor or an abuse survivor, and their scars on the outside heal a whole lot quicker than their inside because of the trauma that happened to their brain and their body. And then I like this part. It's also defined as a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. That's actually from Webster. Good old Webster. But I love that because it is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. Now, some of you think you get deeply distressed when you drive. That's different. That's different, unless you become in a road rage incident. Had a little girl who was riding with her dad. I say she was little. She was 11. To me, that's little. And they were at a stop sign, or they were coming up to a stop sign, and the dad got so mad at the person in front of him that he went around him and got in front of him at the stop sign. And they went to the next stop sign, and that guy got around him, and so they kind of leapfrogged like that for the next 3 or 4 stop signs until the guy in front of him got out and started shooting at him. That's deeply distressing. And all she could remember, all her little brain would allow her to remember is the sound of the shots and her getting in the floorboard. Now, that is deeply distressing, and that's a disturbing experience. So being able to define trauma so that you understand it. And trauma comes in different ways, and I need you to understand this, that when people say, we had a car accident, and I'm just kind of traumatized by it. And people will go like, it's just a car accident, you just had a fender bender. But I had a lady who, she got hit from behind, and she kept hearing the smash of the bumper and the glass that broke. She would be sitting in a restaurant, and she would hear it again. She would be so understand that trauma affects people different ways. You know why? Because we're all different. Yeah. Praise God. How boring it would be if we were all like me. Right? Somebody said amen? Yes. So let's do some types of trauma, okay? There are 3 or 4 that they talk about, and so I think I just need to lay this groundwork so you understand. The first is the acute trauma. And this results from exposure to a single overwhelming event, so they say. But I want you to understand that just because it's a single overwhelming event doesn't mean that the trauma can't become complex or chronic. They're just using this as an example, okay? So it's stuff like this, maybe a rape or death of a loved one or natural disaster. And the reason they say it's acute is because that it happens just one time. Well, the death of a loved one may happen one time, but it's forever. So that's why sometimes I don't always agree with our secular people. Imagine that. But this is what they say, and it's characteristics of this: detailed memories, omens, hypervigilance, exaggerated startle response. Hypervigilance, like like you're a swivel head everywhere you walk. You know where everybody is at every time. You're overdoing it. Misperceptions or overreactions. When somebody goes through trauma, again, remember they're wounded. So they look through a wounded eye. So what does that mean? Is that when someone comes at them and they say something to them, they're going to take that through a wounded lens. So if someone says, hey, it's good to see you, and they don't say, hey, it's so good to see you, but you say, hey, it's good to see you, they're like, what's wrong with you? Did I do something? Do you not like me right now? They take it through a wounded lens. Some of you are like, I do that now. I've got no trauma. Well, that might be a personality thing. We'll talk about that later. But they look through a different lens. Does that make sense? And so being able to understand that is that these are just, and this is not, and I so want you to get this, this is not, if they have this characteristic, oh, they're acute trauma. These are just kind of examples of it, okay? And the next one is complex trauma. And this results from a single traumatic event that is devastating enough to have a long-lasting effects, like mass casualty, school shootings, the car accident with fatalities involved, refugee dislocation. And here's probably where I disagree just a little bit. And this is, they didn't ask me when they wrote the manual. I wish they would have. Imagine that I have an opinion. But because I see so much of complex trauma, and a lot of times it's not a single traumatic event. It's something that might be repeated, like domestic violence is repeated, child abuse is repeated a lot of times. And so being able to know that it's sometimes complex, it doesn't always result from just a single episode. It can be something that's recurring. And they're going to say, no, that's more chronic, but the lines can kind of get blurred because that's the next one. And the characteristics of this: perpetual mourning or depression, chronic pain, concentration problems, sleep disturbances, or irritability. Now, some of you are just irritable, you're just irritated all the time. Doesn't mean that you've had trauma. So, when we look at that, perpetual mourning or depression, see, death of a loved one could become complex. You see, it can move from complex to acute. It doesn't just stay somewhere. They're just trying to give us a baseline, and I'm going to tell you the reason that they do this. And this is why I'm so thankful I get to work in ministry at JBOC, is because they need this for insurance coding. So that when they can pay and they can do things, they can say, no, it's acute, or it's complex, or it's chronic. Because if you're acute, then you're only going to get like 4 sessions. If it's complex, you might get 6. If it's chronic, you might get 7 or 8 that they'll pay for. And I'm just being honest. About that. Because really, when we start talking about trauma or losing a loved one or going through something that's pretty bad, 4 or 5 sessions usually aren't enough. How do you equate 4 or 5 sessions to losing somebody for the rest of your life? How do you equate 4 or 5 sessions to something that's been so traumatic, or your childhood from you being a child and never talked about it, never had a voice, to 4 or 5 sessions? It may take you a little longer than that. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so just being able to understand that's why I want you to know that it can move from one to the other. And the last one that they tell us is chronic. And this is from extended exposure. And examples are prolonged exposure to violence or bullying, profound neglect, a series of home removals. And people don't think about that, but when we have foster kids and they keep going from home to home to home to home, pretty soon they start feeling like nobody wants them. And they're probably in that foster home because of something traumatic. And so I think that death of a loved one could be chronic, because it's an extended exposure to losing somebody. And so I think when we start talking about the types of trauma, understanding that it can move from acute to complex to chronic, bottom line is trauma is going to affect every fiber of your being at one point or another. And it's us learning how to go, how then do I work through that? How do I give that away? How do I let God heal me? Because we say this all the time at JBOT. When you sit in front of me, or sit in front of any of our counselors, the first thing I'm going to tell you is, I am not your healer, but I will guide you to Him. We're like the Mount Everest guides. We're gonna just guide you through or around that mountain. But understanding that there are types of trauma. See, JBOC, what I love about JBOC is we don't use 3. We just use 1. And the word is trauma. You have trauma. I don't need to know if it's acute. I don't need to know if it's complex. I don't need to know if it's chronic. You have trauma. Let us get you to the healer. And so the characteristics of this is denial and psychological numbing, disassociation, rage, social withdrawal, sense of foreshadowed future, meaning the future's not good, maybe I don't need to be here anymore. And here's the thing, the three and all the characteristics can go with any of them, by the way. So the characteristics for acute could be with complex or chronic or vice versa. Does that make sense? They're just putting that up there so that we would have a baseline to understand that's kind of what they mean. Now, denial and psychological numbing can come from acute trauma, from a first trauma. It can be complex. I have watched people disassociate on what would seem like not a severe trauma. Again, everyone is different. And if we start judging people like, oh, you should be over that by now. Ethan says, slap him in Jesus' name. Then I think we've missed it. I think we've missed it. And it appears, and I understand that this better than ever now, is now that I have been able to, by the grace of God, work with trauma victims and watch them let go and heal. Some of them take 10 sessions. Some of them are still with me, and it's been 2 years. Trauma affects your whole body. This next slide, this quote, I don't know who said it, but it says, trauma is not defined by how big an event is. You don't define trauma. Your brain does it for you. And you can't control how it gets processed unless you come and get some good trauma counseling. Now, I'm not saying come to JBOT, although if you're really, I'm just kidding. If you want the healer, don't go anywhere that doesn't say Jesus is going to heal you, because you can't get complete healing apart from Jesus. So what does trauma look like? So natural disasters, such like floods, earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, wildfires. I can't imagine what the people in California felt like. You know, we give California a hard time for a lot of reasons. But those people, they lost their homes. They lost their horses. They lost their livelihood. So I can't imagine how that feels. I've been able to work with some Hurricane Katrina victims. One was holding on for dear life in the tree for about 3 days before she was found. I can't imagine that. And so natural disasters, the hurricane that just came through Griffin, you know, talking to people that I know that lived through that and the sound of that and what that looks like. So natural disasters are a big trauma for folks. Car crashes, I talked about that. Abuse, whether by somebody such as molestation, rape, or physical, or by yourself, such as addiction, self-harm, or suicidal ideation. We forget that. We think sometimes it's just our teenagers who deal with suicide or suicidal ideation. That just means I'm thinking about it. And I keep recurring thinking about it. Our military has a hard time with this because they have seen things that they were not supposed to see. God never wanted, if we go back to Genesis, God never wanted us to see this. And our first responders are people who work with kids. And I think Jane, what you guys do at Peak, you know, there probably is some things that happen there that you just kind of go, oh my gosh. But our teachers that face stuff today, I can't imagine our teachers right now. Whew, my hat's off to them. Bullying includes cyberbullying, mass shootings, terror attacks, divorce, homelessness, loss, grief, witness to a harmful event. All of those things and more can be trauma. All of those things and more can be trauma. And so what does trauma do? Well, it kind of looks like this. It's just a cute little picture I made of your brain. Your brain comes really sick when you have trauma. Because more than anything else, I want you to understand that your brain was never meant to have trauma or abuse or loss. That is not how God first made us. But now that we have, and I love this, it goes back to who's your healer. Remember in Isaiah when we read this, and he said, you restored me to health and you let me live. And then he went on to say, and I love this, surely it was for my benefit that I suffered such anguish. Your brain becomes very sick. And the great thing is you don't have to stay there. So let me talk just a few minutes about the body keeps score. So anytime, and I want you to get this, it's not going to be on the screen, so let me just talk for a few minutes. Anytime that you have a trauma, your body keeps score. Back in 1995, there was a doctor by the name of Bessel van der Kolk, and he wrote a book called The Body Keeps Score. And from that launched this great, a study and investigation. He's one of the leading trauma therapists, not just in our country, but around the world. But this is what he said in a nutshell. He said that any time something traumatic happens, whether it's a car wreck or a loss or an abuse or a bullying, whatever that trauma is, your body keeps score. What does that mean? It means, if you've ever had any kind of trauma, you ever had like headaches and you don't know why? Or joint aches? All of a sudden you get up and you're like, golly, why is my back hurting so bad? Or all of a sudden, you have this pain in your leg. Your body's trying to kick out trauma. It doesn't know any other way to do it than to start making you hurt a little bit. Because the body keeps score. Every time that you go through something traumatic, your body goes, okay, I'm going to absorb it, and then I'm going to try to kick it out. That's why trauma therapy, I feel like I'm really not doing a commercial for J-Block, but that's why trauma therapy is so important. Because your body doesn't know how to kick it out, so you get to learn how to kick it out the right way. And so, some of the physical symptoms of trauma, what I just said, headaches and stomach aches, weight loss or gain, sleep problem, hypervigilant, hyperarousal. Your body was never meant to have this. And so it's as if it begins to live it every day. It lives it over and over and over again. So you think when something traumatic happens, anybody ever been in a car wreck, right? Or you know what's coming, so you tense up, right? Because you know the car's about to hit you, or you see it, so you tense up. So what happens, because your body has kept score, it's going to keep doing that. Every time you get to a car, it'll tense. Every time you hear a screech, it tenses. When you watch a movie and you see it, your body, it'll start reliving it. It relives that trauma over and over and over. Now you see why it's so important that we understand what trauma is. What happens in our body is that anytime, and this is really good, this is really cool, I'm going to really go into this next week, but in our brain, you've heard of the threat assessment center, the amygdala, right? The fight, flight, or freeze. We've said that, we've heard that, you're like, oh yeah, I know all about that. Well, it's a really cool function for your brain, so when something happens, God allows us to be ready. We get all these two hormones that get released, and we're ready. So two hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, get released anytime something happens that we have to handle in a big way, or something traumatic happens. So boom, all this gets released, and we're able to handle it. And that's why some people, they're so good during a traumatic event, and afterward they're like, whoo, right? Because what happens a lot of times is once that happens and we're done with it, the receptors go, we're done, we're good, we don't need any more cortisol, we don't need more adrenaline, we're good. What happens when it's traumatic is those receptors pull back. And so those hormones keep producing. So your body starts what? Living it over and over and over again. When your body does that, and it keeps living it over and over again, it starts tensing up again. It's gonna take you right back to that place. Even if in your mind you're not there, your body will be. Because trauma affects not just the brain, it affects the body. And that's why when people come in and they say, I feel like I've been sick for years. I've had this chronic pain. I just can't get rid of this headache. I can't get rid of this, right? what happens is the body's reliving it over and over again, and it becomes such a chronic pain that they don't know it's from this trauma. And so when you start coming in and you start getting with God and you start getting that out in a safe place, people are like, I have not felt this good in years. It's because it's your body. It's keeping score. Does that make sense? Anybody am I ringing anybody's bell out there yet? Ding ding. I got one ding ding out there. And then the effects of trauma on the brain. So that's what I call a trauma fog. We used to say this, and it's still true in addiction. When people are starting to come clean, there's a fog up in their brain. Well, it's the same thing with trauma. And so if you have a trauma and addiction, you get really foggy up there. But it's a fog that doesn't allow you to see things. It's a fog that doesn't allow you to actually do what you should. It'll make you hide. It'll make you run. It'll make you isolate. And what happens is that we can't concentrate. We have memory loss. We have no motivation or ambition. When trauma hits, you got to think when that cortisol and that adrenaline is pumping, that means your mind is doing what? Working overtime. When you lay down, when you've had traumatic experiences, and especially when we have military and first responders, those kind of things, PTSD, that is all their brain thinks about. It's kind of like getting on 285 and never getting off. What was that baseball player, right? Yes, we called him 285, right? Because he's trying to get to the stadium, he kept being on 285. The really cool thing about 285 is there are exits. You can get off that. But when you have trauma, you stay there. You don't know how to get off. And so when you have that fearfulness or that isolation, you start believing the lie. You start acting out the lie because all of a sudden your body's not good. Your body starts hurting. Your body, have you ever just walked in somewhere and I have done this many times when I've walked in somewhere that reminded me of, especially being a cop, walked in somewhere when it's reminded me of a bad call we've had. I can walk into certain places, I won't name them right now, and all of a sudden my body becomes tense without me even knowing it. And I'm like, I am tense right now. Why am I tense? Oh, I remember now. My body remembers sometimes before I even do, because it keeps score. And then my mind starts to flood of emotions. And so if you ever see most of our homeless, not most, but a lot of our homeless are military vets, some by choice, and some because they just can't get out of this. And so trauma does something that's so incredibly hard to our body and brain. And next week, I really want to show you this incredible game-changing aspect that they showed us about the flight, fight, or freeze. There's two other things that happen in that, and it's going to be a game changer. What I want you to know is that when we are in this traumatic state, that we try to hide. We hide sometimes we hide behind a bottle. Sometimes we hide behind drugs or relationships. Sometimes we'll hide behind a workout or Amazon. But we start doing things that we shouldn't. And more than anything, I want you to remember that you don't have to stay in this state. And next week, I'm going to show you how to get out of it.